Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Moonlight Graham, and welcome to the second episode of Covert and Classified. Many historians have wondered and pondered the question, how did Germany make the technologically advanced weapons they possessed during World War II, just 17 years after World War I, and seriously challenge the world a second time in global conflict? How did they go from making planes that look like this to this? How did they make the world's first ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile? And they did this after going through a brutal economic depression and a society rife with starvation and internal political turmoil that was tearing the country apart. It's a good question, but I think I may have a partial answer to this valid query. Let's go back in time a bit to the end of World War I. When World War I ended in 1918 with the defeat of the Kaiser's Germany, the German leaders were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles that severely punished Germany. The option for not signing the treaty was the continuation of the war that Germany was beginning to struggle with due to lack of resources and able-bodied men to fill their depleted ranks. Plus, the United States had just entered the war 1 year before and added to the list of enemies Germany was having to fight. Up to 3 million Germans, including 15% of its men, had been killed in the war thus far, and Germany was at the end of its rope. Even more humiliating for the German leaders and populace were the terms of Germany's surrender. After signing the Treaty of Versailles, they were forced to become a republic instead of a monarchy. They were not allowed to have an air force or have any submarines, as well as drastically reducing the size of their military. World War I's Allied victors blamed Germany for starting the war and for committing horrific atrocities, as well as upending European peace with secretive treaties. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just blame Germany for the war, it demanded financial restitution for the conflict under the War Guilt Clause, which identified Germany as the sole responsible party for the war. The treaty forced Germany to pay reparations to the tune of 132 billion gold marks. That is more than $500 billion by today's standard. Germany was also required to evacuate not only Belgium, France, and Alsace and Lorraine, but all of the rest of the left west bank of the Rhine River. Germany also had to neutralize that river's right bank between the Netherlands and Switzerland as well. This land they were forced to give up made up over 48% of Germany's iron production and a large portion of its coal-producing mines and factories, which drastically limited its economic power and income. This contributed to Germany's post-war economic problems and decline. Shortages of food and fuel had rendered the German population desperate and vulnerable to the influenza pandemic that was sweeping Europe back then as well. The German mark, which was the name of their money, was near worthless, where 100,000 marks were equal to $1 American back then. German citizens actually used wheelbarrows to haul their near-worthless German money to banks, and some people even made clothing out of it. Some even let their children play with it or burned it instead of wood to heat their homes. Can you imagine burning your money to heat your house? Well, perhaps in this day and age it's not so much different for us considering the rising cost of our PG&E bills, but I digress. Humiliated and defeated, the German people struggled to understand their country's uncertain future. Citizens faced poor economic conditions, skyrocketing unemployment, political instability, and profound social change. For the next 15 years, the country was essentially spiraling out of control, with no discernible end to its decline in sight. That is until 1932, when Hitler came to power, becoming chancellor and steered the desperate and aimless German people in a direction that would have future psychologists and historians shaking their heads in disbelief. Once Hitler came to power, Germany completely stopped paying their dues that the Treaty of Versailles required of them. The treaty restricted Germany from making conventional weapons or piston-driven tanks and submarines that they used in World War I. But Germany worked around this ban by concentrating in developing new weapons that were not covered under the Treaty of Versailles, such as rocket-propelled planes, jet airplanes, and V-1 or V-2 rockets, which nobody else in the world were really conceiving at this time. That is the partial reason that Germany came out so strong with these new advanced weapons at the beginning and towards the end of World War II. Near the end of World War II, Nazi Germany was pursuing a diverse array of Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons as they called them. The division of valuable production resources to so many experimental technologies reflected an almost megalomaniacal tendency to believe science could compensate for Nazi Germany's materially untenable position while combating the combined might of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Germany would secretly develop weapons like the jet-powered Comet plane. The Comet was the first rocket-powered aircraft, and this marked the beginning of the use of rockets in aviation. These proved devastating for the Allies, as none were shot down in the air, and the lone Comet alone accounted for over 9 kills of the enemy. The Allies were eventually forced to attack them on the ground or when they were landing, since they couldn't do anything when they were in the air due to their sheer speed of 620 miles per hour. The Allied planes back then couldn't catch them when in flight, since the Allied planes' max speed back then was anywhere from 350 to 450 miles per hour. Towards the end of World War II, Germany introduced the Me-262 jet fighter, which was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. It was more effective than the Comet because it had more conventional flying characteristics and a speed advantage over piston engine planes that were being used by the Allies. The Me-262 proved to be an effective dogfighter against Allied fighters, flying at a max speed of 560 miles per hour, which was still about 100 miles per hour faster than the Allies' fastest fighter plane at that time. German pilots claimed a total of 542 Allied aircraft shot down with the Me-262, although higher claims have sometimes been made. But just like any airplane, it was also vulnerable to being attacked on landing. Plus, the Me-262's jet engines, being brand new technology, had to be overhauled every few flight hours, or they would catastrophically fail. It is believed in some speculative circles that if the Me-262s had been introduced early in the war instead of later towards the end of the war, that the outcome of World War II could have been a bit different. Another interesting German aircraft that had a much more sinister plan in mind for its use was the Horton HO-229 fighter jet and the Horton 18 bomber flying wing. The Horton flying wing was also called the America Bomber Flying Wing, and in December of 1944, the Horton brothers proposed this futuristic bomber design and was given the go-ahead to start building them. It was a flying wing powered by 6 turbojets embedded on the back of its fuselage. These were derived from the same engines that were being used on the German Me-262 jet fighters. The plan for this jet-powered flying wing was to fly all the way from Germany to New York for devastating bombing runs without refueling. With 6 jet engines and a smaller wing cross-section, the Horton flying wing would also have a much smaller radar profile, making it hard to detect by the rudimentary radar systems the Allies were using at that time. Essentially, it would have been the first stealth bomber ever created. Fortunately, the war would end before this long-range jet bomber would have a chance to visit New York City with its devastating payload. And the Americans, upon finding the factory that housed and produced the Horton's flying wing, along with some unfinished prototypes and blueprints, immediately packed them up and sent them back to the States for closer inspection. Strangely enough, it would be decades later when the Americans would introduce their own flying bomber wing to the world that many know now as the Northrop Grumman B-2 stealth bomber that resembles the HO-18. But there was another German craft that was being thought about in the late 1930s called the Silber Vogel, which in German means silver bird. The Silber Vogel was to be a liquid-propelled, rocket-powered suborbital bomber for Nazi Germany. Basically an intercontinental space plane that could be used as an extreme long-range bomber, hence its consideration for the American bomber mission. It was designed to carry an 8,000-pound bomb with a unique surveillance system believed to make it immune to radar detection. In theory, it sounds like the ultimate weapon. Well, it was way too advanced for the period, and German engineers ran into all kinds of technical difficulties. Prototypes kept overheating, and eventually the whole project was put on hold in 1942. Money and resources were subsequently diverted to other projects. The Silber-Vogel project was the brainchild of aerospace engineer Eugene Sanger and engineer-physicist Irene Brett. Interestingly enough, after the war, Sanger and Brett were highly sought-after aerospace experts and assisted the French space program. Their Silber-Vogel winged spacecraft design was later implemented into America's space shuttle, and its regenerative engine cooling design, now referred to as the Sanger-Brett design, is now used on all modern rockets. So, a failed Nazi attempt to create a long-range bomber to attack the United States ultimately contributed to the successful space programs of numerous nations. Certainly a much better legacy in the long run, to be sure. And finally, one can't ignore or forget the V-1 and V-2 intercontinental ballistic missiles that would terrorize London and other Allied cities that they were also deployed against. Not as futuristic or sci-fi as some of the other weapons the Germans were conceiving, but the V-2 rocket was one wonder weapon that proved its worth to the Germans. The V-weapons, or vengeance weapons as they were called, were developed early on and were deployed quite considerably and successfully, especially against London. Designs began as early as 1930, but there wouldn't be a successful run until 1942. Hitler was initially unimpressed, calling it merely an artillery shell with a longer range and a much higher cost. In reality, the V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, making it quite an innovation for the times. They used an extremely powerful liquid ethanol fuel that allowed the V-2 to launch and fly 6 miles vertically into the sky before proceeding on an arced course. This made it practically impossible to intercept the V-2s without knowing their intended target. Upon beginning its descent down onto the target, the V-2 missile would travel at speeds of 4,000 miles per hour, not detonating until it had penetrated several feet below the ground. When these weapons were finally unleashed upon London in 1944, they rained down death and destruction, causing nearly 10,000 casualties. The V-2 rockets were designed at the Peenemünde Army Research Center in the Baltics and manufactured at the Middelwerk Underground Factory, which both under the control of project head Dr. Wernher von Braun. Middelwerk utilized forced slave labor from the Mittelbrau-Dora concentration camp to work in the factory. After the war, both the Americans and the Soviets scrambled to capture as many V-2 rockets and German scientists as possible. Dr. von Braun surrendered to the United States Army and subsequently was instrumental in building their space program that later on would be called NASA. In effect, Dr. von Braun's V-2 rocket technology launched the space age. Upon doing research about all the wonder weapons that Nazi Germany had in mind back then, I soon realized there were way more than I had ever heard of or could ever imagine. Weapons like the whirlwind cannon, which was designed to create whirlwinds to take down Allied aircraft. Or the sun gun, which was first conceived in 1929 by German physicist Hermann Oberth. His design was for a space station with a 100-meter wide concave mirror that would be used to catch the sunlight and concentrate it in a tight beam back to Earth as a heat weapon. So to summarize, the Treaty of Versailles, as I had mentioned earlier in my video, was certainly instrumental in the Germans coming up with innovative and creative ideas for inventing such wild and far-out wonder weapons. But it doesn't fully answer the question. Perhaps it can be found in the cryptic quotes by German rocket scientists Hermann Oberth and Wernher von Braun, who pioneered rocket design for the German Reich during World War II, and later advanced rocket technology for the American manned space launches for NASA. When asked how they developed and thought of the technologically advanced weapons before and during the war, Oberth's cryptic response was, "We cannot take the credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped." When asked by whom, he replied, "The people of other worlds." Wow. Wernher von Braun echoed similar knowledge of the extraterrestrial reality when, according to the book Above Top Secret by Timothy Good and William Morrow in 1988, when Braun stated, "We find ourselves faced by powers which are far stronger than hitherto assumed, and whose base is at present unknown to us. More I cannot say at the present. We are now engaged in entering into closer contact with those powers, and within 6 or 9 months' time, it may be possible to speak with more precision on the matter. Just who were the people of other worlds that Dr. Oberth spoke of? And were both of these esteemed German scientists making oblique references to one of UFOlogy's most pervasive and tantalizing myths, the alleged link between the Nazi Third Reich and extraterrestrials? Who knows for sure, because both men are now deceased, and we can't pursue that mythical UFO connection with more pressing and direct questions. And that is definitely a subject for another show for another time. Anyways, thank you all for watching. I'm Moonlight Graham, and I'll see you soon on the next episode of Covert and Classified. Till then, my friends.